So a very warm welcome to this session on why the church should care about housing. I'm Jonathan Evans, Associate Vicar for Hartedge at St Martin in the Fields, and this session is part of Living God's Future Now, the online festival of theology, ideas and practice from Hartedge. We'll be saying more about Hartedge at the end of the session, and as I said, my colleague Ben will post information in the chat as well. We do want you to make use of the chat as we go through. Do post any questions or comments in the chat as soon as you have them, and feel free to use the chat for discussion of the issues that our panel are raising. There will be a breakout group as part of the session, so that will also be a chance to formulate questions and comments and reactions and responses. We'd ask you to mute your mics or remain muted until you're invited to speak. That will minimize background noise for other people and improve the quality of the recording that we're making of at least the panel discussion of this session. Conscious that 8 million people are living in substandard, overcrowded or unaffordable accommodation across the country, the Archbishop of Canterbury's Commission on Housing, Church and Community has called for this to be a major element of the Church's mission in coming years, and is encouraging a culture change that sees engaging with housing need as a creative and natural way to engage with our local communities. This workshop will explore ways in which all churches can get involved in housing need locally, and also make the theological basis for doing so. We're very grateful to the Right Reverend Dr. Graham Tomlin, Bishop of Kensington, for suggesting and organising this workshop. Graham is President of St Mellitus College and was the first Dean of St Mellitus. Soon after becoming Bishop of Kensington, he was very involved in the response to the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. He was also the Vice Chair of the Archbishop of Canterbury's Commission on Housing, Church and Community. So we're thrilled that he's with us for this session today. I'm going to hand over to Bishop Graham, and he's going to introduce Lynn Cullens and Chris Beals and the session itself. Thank you very much, Bishop Graham.
Thank you, Jonathan. And hopefully you can all hear me okay. Is that all right? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Wonderful. You never quite know with Zoom. But no, very good to see you today, and thanks for joining this call. And as Jonathan was saying, just a little bit of introduction to me. I think Jonathan said most of it already, but I guess the reason I got involved in housing is, well, I don't come to this as a great expert on housing at all. In fact, when I became Bishop of Kensington 5.5 years ago, I knew very little about housing other than the kind of normal things that most people know about them. Really, I got involved in it because of Grenfell. Grenfell happened in one of the parishes that I'm responsible for in 2017. And I guess out of that, it was partly being involved in the community response to that, and particularly the church response to it, but particularly beginning to dig beneath the surface and asking some of the kind of deeper questions about what what issues this raised for our society more generally, rather than just the immediate one of sort of fire safety. Led me to write a report on the kind of aftermath of Grenfell. Which came out of a series of conversations with local people and local groups and volunteers and faith groups and others. And one of the issues came out of that was housing. And clearly Grenfell raised the big housing question. And so I kind of naturally got interested in housing, got to know a little bit about the housing crisis and debates around it, and then was asked by Archbishop Justin to be the vice chair of this new commission that he was going to put together. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But we had a group of 10 over 10 really fantastic commissioners. It was a very strong group of people that were brought together to think deeply about this issue. And I'm delighted we've got two of the commissioners with us today, and I shall ask them to introduce themselves. Firstly, Lynn Cullens. Great to have you with us, Lynn. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself and your involvement in housing and what you do? And yeah, over to you.
Thank you. So yes, as Jonathan said at the start, I'm a parish vicar. I'm rector of Stockport and Brinnington in Greater Manchester. So I've got 4 church buildings in the centre of Stockport. And as I put in the report, I don't need to go out looking for housing need as a parish vicar. Housing need comes for me. And we meet people day in, day out who are sleeping rough or having issues of affordability. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that as a parish vicar, as a church leader. Before ordination, I had involvement in housing management. I was also a housing officer in Stoke-on-Trent, in Mere in Stoke-on-Trent, and I've also led tenant engagement and tenant involvement for a registered social landlord. So I had quite an interest in housing, always tried to work in areas of deprivation and challenge, and always found God in those places. So I was delighted to be asked to be on the commission, and I help lead the work on local church and community.
Thank you, Lynn. And we also have Chris Beals with us. So Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background with housing.
Okay, yes. I'm a retired parish priest and industrial chaplain and sort of entrepreneur, I suppose. I've always enjoyed dabbling in things. Many years ago, I set up a charity called Employment Forum UK, which is where I came across Jonathan. John was at that point working in Job Centre Plus, and I think I was probably on the scrounge. The work with Employment Forum led on to some really interesting training work in the East End, and through that to work with Afghan diaspora. And that led me into work with Afghanistan, and I spent 12 years running a training and business incubation centre in Kabul, where we were training young people in making carpets and clothes and setting up businesses and so on. But I suppose what I really enjoy doing is local economic development. And it seems to me that housing is absolutely at the heart of that. So I got involved with some work in Houghton Regis in central Bedfordshire a few years ago, and I'm still doing that actually, where the churches wanted to respond to new housing by setting up a community centre. And so I'm still very much involved with that work. And then a couple of years ago, started to do some work for the Diocese of Gloucester on their strategic approach to new housing. And I'm still involved with that. From 2017 to 19, having just retired from where I'd been a half-time parish priest, I came back up to Hartlepool, where I'd been an industrial chaplain 40 years ago. And I got a William Leach Research Fellowship at the University of Durham, looking at new housing across the Northeast. And that work, I think, is what really sparked me on housing issues and led to my being asked to join the Housing Commission. So my work has been focused mainly on working with national church institutions and dioceses, and I'll say a bit more about that shortly.
Thank you, Chris. So the way this seminar is going to work is that Lynn and Chris and I are going to give a little bit of input, so we're going to overview of some of the work we've been doing on the Commission. We're then going to go into breakout groups for about 15 minutes just to sort of chew over some of those issues. Then we're going to come back together for some Q&A and discussion around that. And I think the aim is to finish at around 6 o'clock. That's the plan for it. So just to introduce something of the Commission, where it came from is this book that some of you will have read. You probably know about it. It's Archbishop Justin's book, Reimagining Britain, that came out in 2018. And in the book, he basically tries to think about what Britain would look like if it was reshaped according to some of the values of Christian faith that go back so far into our history. And he looks at a number of different issues in the book, so things like the family, education, health, economics and finance and so on. And one of those chapters was on housing. And so he decided to dig deeper into these issues by a number of commissions. And the first of these was the one on housing. And you'll know recently he set up another couple on the care system and on the family in particular. But the first of these was on housing. And so Lynn, Chris and I were 3 of a group of 10 commissioners brought in, which included a number of housing experts, former civil servants. So we had Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees was on it. We had people who were, we had a former chair of the National Housing Federation, people who were involved in housing associations. So a really sort of expert group of people to look at it. And so we started out, wanted to do some work on a theology of housing, just to kind of ask ourselves, okay, we're a Christian group. We're the Church of England looking at housing. We don't just want to come up with something that is the same as all kinds of other reports on housing, because of course there are numerous of them around the country. Every year has several reports that come out from various groups on housing. What do we distinctively have to bring to the debate on housing as a Christian church? And one of the things we recognized quite early on is that there isn't really a very big, clear picture of what good housing looks like. When you ask, what is the NHS all about? We all know the answer. The NHS is there to provide good quality healthcare to everybody, regardless of their background or income, free at the point of need. That's what the NHS is for. We could probably all say something like that. We've got a very clear idea of what good looks like in healthcare, what the NHS is about. When you ask what's good housing, and especially when you ask government what's good housing, they don't really seem to have a very clear. We had a number of meetings with government departments and ministers, and asking that question, there wasn't a very clear sense of what it is. There's clearly a government aspiration to build lots of them, but there's not a very clear idea of actually what good looks like. And so we wanted to do some work on that question. What does good housing look like? And so just give you a brief summary of this, and I'm going to try and share my screen at this moment, if I can. That work? Okay, good.
Yes, that works.
So what was a Christian perspective on housing? And I suppose the first recognition was actually the story of the Bible is actually a story about housing. It's a story about home. It begins with, if you like, a home provided for us by God in this beautiful planet, which is our home, and then goes on to tell the story of our abuse of that hospitality, our trashing of the home in which God has placed us. And then the long story of redemption through the history of Israel, leading up to the coming of Christ. Now, the central point of the story where God makes his home with us in the person of Christ, putting down roots in the places of Nazareth and Capernaum and Bethany and Jerusalem and so on. And then goes on to the story of the coming of the church, and then finally the new creation, which in the book of Genesis we're told in that last bit of the chapter, that last bit of the book where God makes his home with us. And so if you like, you've got 5 bits of the story in that story of the Bible. And we kind of mapped that story onto 5 key values as we thought housing was about. So the doctrine of creation tells us that housing, good housing, has to be sustainable. It must not do violence to the world that we've been given. It must be housing that is properly sustainable, that fits with its local environment and is good, a healthy housing that fits with the planet that God has given us. The doctrine of the full tells us that if we are not careful, if we don't pay attention, there's always this element of housing, like anything else, that tends to go bad on us. And therefore, safety, we need to have particular interventions to make sure that housing is properly safe, because if we don't pay attention, if we are careless about our housing, it becomes unsafe. So housing needs to be safe from incursion, from unwanted visitors. It needs to be safe from flood, from fire, from all the things that might destroy housing. The doctrine of the incarnation at the heart of redemption, where God puts down roots in human life, tells us that housing needs to be stable. It needs to be housing that is that enables people to put down roots in a community for as long as they want to. It needs to be good, stable housing. The doctrine of the church, this new community, where all the barriers of humanity are broken down, tells us that housing, if it's going to reflect the story of the gospel, has to be sociable. It needs to create community. It has to have space so you can invite your neighbors in, and you can exercise hospitality, and housing developments need space that enable community to happen. And then finally, the new creation is a picture of this glorious kind of garden city, the new Jerusalem that comes down from heaven, that is full of jewels and beauty and so on. And so therefore, if housing reflects that part of the story, it needs to be deeply satisfying. It needs to be, well, beauty is a bit of an eye in the beholder, which is why we didn't want to use that word necessarily, but it's a house that you long to come back to because you enjoy living there. So if you like, there were our 5 key values in what housing should be like. It should be sustainable, it should be safe, it should be stable, it should be sociable, and it should be satisfying. Now, we also came up with another S, if you like, which was part of our story, which is not so much a descriptor of housing, but a factor without which we will not solve the housing crisis that, as Jonathan mentioned, leaves 8 million people across our country in unstable or unsafe or unsuitable housing. And that sixth S is sacrifice. And that, of course, goes to the heart of our Christian faith as well. There's the recognition that the sacrifice, the cost of the housing crisis, is borne unequally at the moment by those at the receiving end, those living in unsafe, unstable, overcrowded housing. But that sacrifice needs to be borne across the board by government, by housing associations, by landowners, by everybody, all actors in the housing crisis. Together, as a society, we need to be involved in making the sacrifices that are going to be needed. We can't solve this by assuming that everyone's going to get richer all the time. There has to be an element of sacrifice in it. Now, as a result of that was basically our framework for what we came up with in terms of our picture of good, what housing looks like. We've got a call to government in it. We centered our analysis of the housing crisis on affordability, that we have a crisis not so much of availability, but affordability, that we don't have enough affordable houses. And even when we talk about affordable houses, they're not truly affordable, because houses that are just as a discount to the market rate don't necessarily bring those houses within the reach of local people in many parts of the country. So we have a crisis of affordability. And what we are bedeviled by in our political life is short-termism. Every new housing minister comes in, a new policy comes about. Very often they don't really make much of a difference. And so what we call for in government is a long-term plan. So just like with climate change, we have a plan for 2050. We know that as a nation, we want to be carbon neutral. And that's driving some really significant change in the present with regard to our environmental actions. We need a similar plan for housing. So in 20 years' time, how many affordable houses do we need? How are we going to retrofit houses for sustainability? How are we going to make sure that housing is properly safe and sociable and so on? And then work out what the cost of that is, and then work out how we're going to pay for it in the meantime. Without that long-term plan, we're not going to make much progress. But the other key thing about this report is that we didn't want it to be just another report that's saying, here's the problem, government, you go and sort it out, and here's the bill. There are not many reports like that, because we were aware that we as the Church of England are, if you like, part of the problem and part of the answer, because we are major landowners ourselves. We own 200,000 acres across the country. Not all of that is developable. The church commissioners own around 92,000 acres of land, 6,000 acres of which we do know is developable, strategic land as it's called. And therefore we wanted to play our part in solving the housing crisis. And that's really where the church comes in. That's the kind of focus of this seminar, which is not so much on government, but is what can the church do at national level, at diocese level, and at local parish level to address the housing crisis. And we felt here was something really a vital missional opportunity for the church, where we could be involved in local communities across the country, a way to reach out and give something that's really significant to local communities. If we can get involved in housing need at that local level. And this would be a fantastic witness to the gospel. It's a way of telling the gospel in bricks and mortar. That gospel that tells us, goes from Genesis to Revelation, those 5 key values. If we can create housing like that, it is telling the gospel in practical bricks and mortar around the country. So there is general background to it. I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to say a little bit about what the Commission was recommending at diocesan level as well. So over to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much. In our original instructions, we were told that this was why the church should be involved. And I often think that we answer the word why, or the question why, with because. Why should the church be involved? Because it would be loving, because it would be whatever. But if you answer the question in order to, why be involved? In order to change the world, in order to provide the kind of housing that people really need and can afford, in order to ensure that those who are left out get a decent roof over their heads, in order to, and the 5 values. So what we've tried to do in the work with dioceses and national church institutions is to think about and to raise ways of making happen things that we really can do to make a difference. What we're looking for are 2 particular things. One is what you might call some quick wins. And in the report, we talk about, for example, a particular proposal in Newham and another one in Middlesbrough. The Newham one is on 3 church sites, is to have 3 new church buildings and community facilities, a new health centre on one of the sites, and 242 almshouses. Almshouses for people who are key workers mainly, but almshouses because almshouses are not subject to right to buy, because almshouses are owned by a charity, and therefore you can't actually force a charity to give up what it has. So therefore, for the benefit of their beneficiaries forever. We're also working on a project in Middlesbrough, 48 almshouses on a church site where the church building has to be pulled down as it's unsafe, and combining that with some council land. And in the Diocese of Gloucester, there are plans for a redundant church site. In fact, they're going ahead now to be developed by a housing association for 20 units for homeless people with support services as part of that development. So that's just 3 particular examples, none of which have yet happened. And there are all sorts of issues still to be addressed, but which we are hopeful and praying hard will come to pass. And there are other projects all over the place which are beginning to emerge. But one of the problems is that sometimes we can be incredibly impulsive and we can go for this project and that project, and people come up with good ideas all over the place. So what we recognize as being also essential is to create what you might call a much more strategic approach, so that we can really work out how the core values, the 5 values that Graham has just articulated, can be applied in practice. So that when we're talking to contractors and to their supply chains, they really understand exactly what it is that we believe is so vital if good housing is to be produced, which accords with those core values. Now, to assist this work, we have developed what we call a geospatial map. In fact, it's got a title, the Good Steward Mapping Tool. And we've been working with Knight Frank to do this, and a small research company called IDO. What we now have is, for the first time, I think, in history, a map, a geospatial map of all Church of England owned land and buildings across England. Now, some people see this as a bit of a threat, because they might not want all this land and all these assets to be made public. So we're treading very carefully. We're not planning to expose all this land to the world and let people make of it what they will, because the fear is that then developers will be queuing up at diocese doors and demanding to have a look at the land that they have. But much more, we're trying to say to dioceses, here is a tool that you can use strategically in order to understand what your assets really look like. Now, there are different kinds of land holdings that the church has. As Graham said, the Church Commissioners has got 92,000 acres of land. It also has another 500,000 acres of mineral rights under the surface of the land. And any building that takes place on land above those mineral rights, the Church Commissioners make a charge for. Of the remaining land, it's a whole mix of stuff. There's lots of glebe land, but it tends to be in small pockets in many places. Glebe, G-L-E-B-E, and of course that used to be the land that would enable a parish to support its local priest. And I think it was about 1970 when glebe land then was handed over to be administered by diocese. And at the moment, it's primarily for the benefit of, well, it is exclusively for the benefit of stipends and paying for clergy. And there will be a motion in July at the General Synod when this will be addressed, but I'll come back to that in a minute. The map will actually identify also lots of benefice land. And in some places, for example, in the Diocese of Gloucester, on 2 vicarage sites, Large Vicarage and Large Garden, actually those sites now hold 20 homes or 40 homes. So it's possible to do something with our land which is way beyond what we might otherwise have imagined, but it's absolutely essential that we bear in mind 2 things. One is that we don't just flog our land off to the developer offering the best price, and they have no say over the future of that land. And the second is, if we retain a stake in the ownership of the land, then there will be an income being generated for the church and its work forever and a day, as well as providing the land for, and this is what we really feel very strongly, truly affordable homes, not just flogging it off for more executive housing, but actually to create truly affordable homes for people that need it. Now, in order to really make this work effectively, we're working on 2 particular things. One is the development of a church housing association. We're at a very early stage in this, but what we believe is that if the church had our own housing association, we wouldn't be wanting to do things exclusively. We'd always be looking to work with partners, but we would have the benefit, if you like, of church land being, as it were, into a virtuous circle, so that we wouldn't be selling the land off. It could go into a church housing association, and a diocese or whoever could retain a share in that, whatever may be the appropriate way forward. But secondly, we'd also be eligible to draw down grants from Homes England. And in the case of our Middlesbrough housing that I was mentioning before, something like £35,000 to £40,000 per housing unit in an area of high deprivation could be drawn down from Homes England. So it really is very, very significant. And the other thing that we're working on, just to mention also, the Diocese of Gloucester, who have been immensely helpful in this whole process, and I have to say, who on behalf of the National Church are actually funding the follow-up to the Housing Commission's report. The Diocese of Gloucester also have their own development company called the Good and Faithful Servant Limited. And its objects are not limited to working only in the Diocese of Gloucester. They've already done a bit of work in some of the neighbouring dioceses, but potentially they could work anywhere in the country. And that brings another kind of expertise. So when dioceses, as they seem so often to do, say, we haven't got the capacity to do all these exciting things, or more likely, actually, we're so scared of doing it, we're not going to do it. We're going to hide our heads in the sand and pretend this is not something we can deal with. I'm being a bit rude there, but actually that's what too many dioceses are like. When they say that, actually, we are beginning to put in place the tools which can enable dioceses to make things happen. And we're going further. We have been approached by a number of people who say, we have access to serious investment, and we would like to work with the church to enable some really serious development. And we're going further than that too. We're actually talking with the CCLA, who are the body of churches and local authorities, whatever it is, who are the investment body for lots of dioceses and parishes and local authorities, talking with them about the possibility of having a discrete housing investment arm, a body which would specifically be for investing in truly affordable homes on land that the church has. Now, these conversations are at an early stage, but we've moved pretty fast in the last few months. And I reckon that by September, we'll have some clear indications of direction. And maybe by this time next year, something definite could be emerging. So I feel very encouraged by this. And two more quick things. In the Diocese of Gloucester, there is now a network of what are called animateurs, which is a slightly kind of effective term. Forgive me, I know Lynn doesn't like it. So connectors, if you like, who are local people who feel called by God, most of them lay people, to work in their local deanery or local authority to make friends and get to know the local planners and developers and housing associations and landlords, and act as an early warning system, if you like, a bridge between those people and local communities, so that people can get an idea of what might be on the cards, what might be fitting in with a local plan and could be developed, where there could be some homes built. Not so that they can instantly react like NIMBYs, because we're utterly opposed to NIMBYs, but so that they have early warning, can actually be enabled to be listened to. So there's proper consultation that takes place, because without good consultation, of course, local communities feel marginalized and so react negatively. And finally, charity law. We've been talking with the government and with the Charity Commission about the need for charity law to be clarified so that we can be clear what we're allowed to do, because so many dioceses and the church commissioners and many charities or organizations hide behind the definition of best value in charity law and think it must apply to best financial value, best price. And therefore, sometimes they do the wrong thing and their reputation is damaged because of that, because they say we're forced to by charity law. Well, they are wrong. It's a misapplication of the law, and we are determined to crack that. Because if we get that right, then the church can start doing good and not feel bad about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, very much indeed. And lastly, we're going to go on to Lynn. who is going to speak a little bit about local churches and what they can do to get involved. So hand over to Lynn.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm going to talk for the next few minutes about what we can do at local church and parish level and what the recommendations of the Commission were. As people have mentioned up to now, we've got 90% of churches meeting needs around food poverty in one way, shape or form. Less than 20% of local churches are meeting any form of local housing need. And that kind of drove us on this area of the Commission's work. How could we increase that proportion, that percentage of local churches that are looking at housing need in their local community and feeling that they can meet it, and how could we build capacity to do so? So that's where we began. We also wanted to look at preventative approaches. Lots of the work that's done in local churches is around crisis intervention or the meeting of emergency needs around homelessness. And that's really good work. But what we wanted to do was look at more preventative approaches. How could we stop people becoming homeless in the first place? So I'm going to begin the next few minutes just by telling you what the 5 key recommendations were for local churches. The first one was that every church seeks prayerfully to discern its own calling to local housing need. Secondly, that we should each understand more about housing need in our local contexts. Thirdly, that once we understand housing need, we should look at our own communities to see whether the housing there is sustainable, safe, stable, sociable, and satisfying, and perhaps identify particular themes from that list which we might address. And then that we set all of that information and all of that discernment against our assets. What land do we hold? What buildings do we have? What investments? What skills? Using perhaps some of those tools now that Chris has mentioned. In my own parish, I have 4 church buildings. You know, we don't need 4 church buildings to be church. I think the last year has shown us that. So how can we repurpose our buildings? How can we meet local housing and community need using the assets that we have? And finally, the 5th one, that local churches and church leaders use their voice and their convening power and their local networks to influence the development of truly affordable housing, and where practicable, develop it themselves, develop it ourselves. So that was the recommendations. And the capacity building that we sought to do was a fewfold, really. Firstly, we provided a bank of resources. These resources are available on the Archbishop of Canterbury's website. Just hold on and I will post that. And you'll find a link on that website to the Housing Justice website. The church resources for local churches are on the Housing Justice website. There's a link to them from the main Coming Home report page that you'll find there. So the resources that we produced theological resources. So we produced, Bishop Graham and Stephen Backhouse produced a very simple, almost 1-page summary of a theology of housing that parish vicars like me could give to my congregation, could give to my PCC, to show a theological justification for why the church should care about housing. There are also a number of videos, short videos, that give further understanding of the theological picture around why we should feel called to meet housing need. And thirdly, and I'm using them in my parish at the moment, there's a 5-week Bible study course that is based on housing, that each week sets the context of a particular church that are meeting housing need in a particular way and encourages people to look at scripture and to pray alongside that process, that discernment process of how we might be called in our own context to meet housing need. The second lot of resources that you'll find on the Housing Justice website are over 40 case studies from up and down the country. The chair of the commission, Charlie Arbuthnot, was asked a few months ago, when's this work going to begin in local churches? And quite rightly, he said, it's already underway. And those 40 case studies are churches and faith communities up and down the country who are meeting local housing need in an amazing variety of ways, from housing advice surgeries to physically building affordable housing themselves. So please do have a look at those. We've also got 20 how-to guides, how to engage missionally with areas of new housing, brought together by the New Housing Hub, really theologically rooted engagement documents for how to pioneer on new housing estates, how to operate on new housing estates where there's no community building or community facilities, really helpful practical advice. And finally, there's a document which is contextualized development guidance for churches. So looking at some of the challenges to development, looking at some of the barriers and how to navigate and overcome them. So with all of those resources, what we would ask, what we would really ask is, please do have a look at them. Please do have a look at some of the case studies, see if you find any inspiration there. And if you have networks, please disseminate the link to the Housing Justice website. And please, let's get those around as many local churches and as local parishes as we can. Already, we're getting so much feedback from local churches saying that they've begun to think through, to pray through new projects around meeting housing need, which is absolutely fantastic. I'm struck whenever I'm talking about this, about Mother Teresa apparently said, we're not all called to great things, but we're all called to do small things with great love. And I think we should bear that in mind, actually, as we're looking at these resources, because I think every church in the country can do something to meet housing need. So some of us are called to great things. So the stuff that Chris was talking about earlier, or the stuff that's happening, Blackburn Cathedral, for instance, are looking at repurposing disused diocesan office space to create supported housing for refugees and asylum seekers. That's a wonderful project, a large project. St Bride's in Old Trafford in Manchester, near where I grew up actually. There they've developed new worship space, a community centre with library, cafe, GP surgery, hairdressers, a nursery, and 81 extra care housing apartments for the over 55s. They've done that in partnership with a local housing association. So those are great things, aren't they? Somebody said the other day that this area of the report could really be an invitation for the local church to act as catalysts for social change in our neighbourhoods. I absolutely love that line. Pray God that happened. But most of us, most church leaders like me, are very time poor. So most church leaders, I feel, are called to do small things with great love, possibly. So some of the smaller projects that are making a huge difference are, we've got a single unit of accommodation being developed by a church in the southwest of England for a member of their congregation who's lived with issues of addiction and has come through rehabilitation, and they now want to support to have a more stable life within the community. That's absolutely wonderful. And also a church in Dent in Cumbria that's developed 2 units of accommodation in an area that's got a lot of holiday lets and second homes. And they've developed those truly affordable housing for local residents, 2 units of accommodation, but that have really lifted the community. But there are even smaller things that make a huge difference. We could have somebody sit on a residence group We could write in support of more truly affordable housing within the local plan process. We could work with specialist providers, third sector providers, to set up housing advice clinics, a whole range of things that we can do. So please do have a look at the resources. And I want to leave you with one final image. I love this image. The image of the lad walking along the beach, and the beach is absolutely covered with thousands of starfish. And he bends down after a few minutes and he picks one up and he puts it back in the sea. And somebody says, well, what difference does that make? There's thousands of them. And he said, it's made all the difference in the world to that one. And that's what I would encourage us to think. What difference can we make? Even if it's to one person, every single church in this country could make some difference in terms of meeting local housing need in their local community. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lynn, very much indeed. So what we're going to do now is I put 3 questions in the chat there. And we're going to go into breakout groups just for about 15 minutes until about past. And the 3 questions are these: what are the key issues this raises for you? What are the kind of issues that this raises in your mind? What on your mind as you've heard it? What questions do you have for the panel? Are there things you want to just bit of clarification on about? You know, what could help you engage with this? And can you think of one way your church can get involved? So that's the plan, and we'll come back together again at past. So we'll group about 4, and I think someone is going to invite us to join rooms now. So see you a bit later on. Your final thought on this, I guess. My should we go to Lynn? And what would be your last thing you'd want to say as we come towards the end of our webinar?
I would really encourage people, if you haven't read it, to just read the executive summary of the report. It's eminently readable. It's a great narrative, actually. It's quite inspiring stuff, and it's only 17 pages long, and there's lots of pictures. So if you haven't, in my breakout group, there was very good points being made about this broader than housing. But I think you'll see that the Commission has actually made recommendations and taken in some of that broader picture. So I think you'd be encouraged by that. Please do have a look at the resources. Please do disseminate the resources. And I think, picking up from Chris's point, that this work will give you a different lens as you go around your parish, your communities. I certainly have. I was asked to go to an estate church elsewhere in my diocese the other day that's really struggling. And we talked about people flows, which is what Chris was talking about. The people flows have changed over time. So that church had been built where there was a strong flow of people, and now the people flow had changed. So we talked about, why not contact the local housing association, see if they'll buy the site that the church is on, and it was in a fairly poor condition. And why don't you buy that shop that's on the roundabout that everybody goes past because it's in a parade where there's a huge flow of people. So once you start to see that the church is the people, not the buildings, you actually get a much more fluid impression for how you can use your assets to meet local housing need and to meet the needs of the community better, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And then Chris, your last 1 minute.
Okay, I'm a fan of church schools. We've got a quarter of the church schools, a quarter of the schools in the country, and they're open to everybody now and not just to church people. I would like to see the church actually take housing as seriously as it does education. And of course, they go together.
Thank you very much. And I guess the last comment from me is just a couple of extra resources. If you're interested in the theology of this, we produced a couple of books as part of the housing report. There's this one here called Coming Home, a Theology of Housing, which is a collection of essays by a number of different theologians on what a theology of housing might look like. So there's that one there, and a very sort of briefer version, good old Grove booklets. There it is, why the church should care about housing, which is by myself and Stephen Backhouse, which is one of the other commissioners there as well. And I think the last thing I would say is that I think there's something here about It's about something about the soul of the Church of England at stake here. If we continue to do what we've done in the past, which tends to be to kind of basically see our land and our property as a cash cow to pay the bills for the church, then that doesn't really bear witness to the kingdom of God. There's something about our willingness to sort of to take some risks in this area, to actually use what God has given us, along the lines of the parable of the talents that Lynn was mentioning just a few moments ago, where we're willing to invest what we have, not just to gain a greater income for ourselves, but actually to bless the communities that we're part of, and to bless people who are struggling with housing need across our country. Then who knows how God might bless us in all kinds of other ways. And so I think there's a real challenge for us here as a church to think creatively about what God has given us. At the moment, one of the things we are very rich in is buildings and land. We may not have as many people in our churches as we had once, but we do have a lot of land and buildings. This is one thing we're rich in. And maybe that's what God is calling us to do, to use this land missionally and to think about how we can use what we've been given for the good of the kingdom of God. I'm going to hand back to Jonathan. And again, thank you for hosting this event today, and hand over to you.
So huge thanks to Bishop Graham, to Lynn and to Chris for all that they've shared. This has been a challenging and a thought-provoking conversation with loads of ideas. There's been creativity and there's been comprehensiveness, I think, in the conversation about the issues that need to be addressed, and that clearly are being taken on board significantly by the Church of England at this time.